All right, let's go ahead and start here with the sectors of the economy. We have already talked about this so far in class, so this should be a little bit of a review, at least these first three sectors. Many economists analyze a country's workforce by dividing it into these three. We can actually, however, identify five, which we'll talk about here in just a minute. Each one of these sectors, guys, has different types of economic activity, which can really show us the relationship between natural resources production and sales. So this is basically the grouping of different industries based on what is produced and then the activities that are found within their workforce. So this can really illustrate a country's economic development plus where people are working. So you guys can see our three pictures right here, and I'm trying to relate it to the automobile industry. So the primary sector, you already know this, it refers to different industries that extract natural resources. These resources can be renewable or non-renewable. Generally, this is done through farming, but it can also be done through mining and fishing and lumbering in a lot of different ways, okay? This sector is absolutely basic to human survival. It goes all the way back to our agriculture unit, which is why this is really considered to be kind of a less developed sector of the economy. All right, let's go over here to the secondary. So we extract the raw material from the ground. Secondary sector of the economy refers to any industry that then processes those raw materials. So processes it in the form of a finished usable item. Typically, this is done through either a building process or through processing, like we saw in food, or in this unit, through manufacturing. This can be divided typically into like a light manufacturing, which might be like a furniture manufacturing store, or heavy manufacturing, which is what we see with the automobile industry. Lastly, then, actually, before we get to that, let's talk really quick about the secondary sector. The secondary sector has what economists call a multiplier effect, and we'll talk about that a little bit more here. A multiplier effect basically tells us that each job creates more jobs. So let's talk about this car manufacturer for a minute. If I were to locate a new car manufacturing plant, that's going to have to attract other jobs like restaurants or movie theaters or businesses or maybe even residency for the people who are going to work in my manufacturing plant. So if I'm going to go to work at the car factory, maybe when I get off work, I want to go to a restaurant or I want to go out to a movie. That is the multiplier effect. One job created other jobs. Workers in a lot of these factories also had more money now to spend on new types of products, which again, their money would then multiply throughout the economy. We know that as different countries progress through stages of development, the secondary sector begins to shrink and the tertiary sector begins to grow. But when we focus on that initial growth, if you look at all of your countries, America, Great Britain, those that went through the Industrial Revolution fast and first really saw that multiplier effect. Very important when looking at that secondary sector. We also know then this tertiary sector, that's where we just basically were when we focused on our urbanization unit. The tertiary sector is then the process of providing the services to different business and consumers, including the movement and the delivery of the goods and the resources that really we just made in step two or in the secondary sector, or even just processing or moving, transporting the goods, transporting the goods from that primary sector. These tertiary sector jobs, these include different services like consumer and retail and wholesale, government services. You guys get the idea, right? What we have to recognize is that there are very few national economies that possess fully formed service sectors. America is one of them. What we know is that because the service sector has gotten so big in some developed countries, we actually can break that down into what we consider the quaternary and the quinary service sectors. So the quaternary sector is known as the knowledge-based sector. sector. In this case, these are services that have been transferred typically to flexible locations. Many times, these are actually sometimes international service jobs. This quaternary sector is one that consists of innovation and inventions that could be scientific research and also development. I think of computer software developers, for example, this GPS in the car, as a really good example of a quaternary sector. Biomedical research is another good example. So then the quinary, this is going to be the highest level of management and decision making within the tertiary sector. Here is where we see decisions that typically have global scale significance. So quinary sector jobs include CEOs, cabinets, presidents, advisory boards, which is why I put Elon Musk on here, the CEO of Tesla, as a quinary sector job. Many of our quinary jobs, these are going to stay within the country because it's important to have that face-to-face interaction. Guys, these different sectors of the economy are so important in understanding different scale. We can understand these sectors at the local scale, so primary, secondary, tertiary. We're also going to see in the next couple of days how these different sectors can also be applied to the global scale. You have primary sector countries, if you will, secondary sector countries, and tertiary. We tend to call the tertiary countries our core countries, and then the periphery would be the countries that are still operating in the primary and secondary sector. We'll talk about that a lot as we go through this unit, but keep in mind that this core periphery idea can relate to so many different concepts. We saw it in urbanization, with your core being your central business district and your periphery being your suburbs. We saw this in the central place theory, where you see the core as your marketplace, and then the periphery are the people and that are willing to go shop there. We can see core periphery then applied here in this final unit. Okay, so we just finished looking at the Industrial Revolution and how it was perhaps one of the greatest changes in human history. The Industrial Revolution created a shift in the economy from purely primary sector economy, right? Agriculture. These were our early primitive agrarian societies, to more industrial secondary sector societies. So as the secondary sector grew, there became a focus then on where to locate industry. We have to note that before we can discuss any factors in factory location, we have to recognize that energy used to be the pure and sole factor that drove the location of factories. For example, for many, many years, water was one of the only sources or primary sources of energy to run our factories. Our early mills then were located on streams and rivers for that type of energy. Later in the 1800s, then, coal became one of the major sources of energy because it could be transported and burned. Factories could be located then in different locations. However, coal is bulky and it is expensive to transport, and therefore, in our early manufacturing, such as maybe our iron mills, they had to locate near coal fields, and you can see that on that map of 19th century British coal fields. It really wasn't until the late 1800s then when we really saw technological advances in electricity that we began to see power become more mobile. Because of that, then, because electricity could be transferred then through wires, energy became less of a consideration in regards to industrial location. Note that some factories and some industries today are still energy oriented or energy dependent. The aluminum industry is a good example of that. Energy demands for aluminum manufacturing are really, really high, and therefore these plants have to be built up near cheap available power. We see a lot of aluminum industry or power plants in Iceland, for example, because they have abundant geothermal energy. So we have to note that while energy is not a driving force today in factory location, for some industries it still is. So what becomes the factors then today that drive location? There are many different factors. Remember, in our very first unit, we talked about site versus situation. Site is the absolute location of an area. So what we have right there in that location. Situation then is what is relative to that location. We're going to then break our factors into site versus situation. There are then some other factors that might impact industrial location, and we'll discuss those as we go through the videos. So we are going to begin then with Weber's least cost theory. Guys, we know that models are really useful in describing patterns and also helping to make predictions. In 1909, Alfred Weber developed a very influential theory that we call today the least cost theory. It helps to explain the decision making by businesses regarding factory locations. So, like all models and all theories, it's not perfect and it doesn't apply universally to every different aspect. So, because of that, Weber developed a really general theory of industrial location. Looking at site, he focused mainly on labor, and situation, focusing mainly on transportation and weight. He also looked then at agglomeration economies, which we'll discuss here in just a little bit. So let's begin with the site factors. There's a couple of major factors that are included here with the absolute location for a new industry or factory. First thing that needs to be considered is land. The assumption in Weber's theory is that all land was flat and uninterrupted. If you think about a location for a factory, you want it to be one story or one level, and therefore an abundance of flat land is really, really important. We know, though, that this rarely exists, and because of natural features and population density, there are different factors then that have to be included when we are looking at land. We'll discuss that in just a minute. Another major component of Weber's theory then as to where a new business was going to locate a factory was labor availability. We can see in the 1950s that most of our factories were located up here in the Great Lakes region. We saw this was our automobile industry. That was really the headquarters. Today, unfortunately, this is called the Rust Belt because we've seen many of our factories leave this northeastern region and really trend south. There's a couple of different reasons for that. Labor availability is higher now in the South than it is in the Northeast. We still have a ton of population in the Northeast, but what we see in our southern states today is one, the availability of cheaper labor. We know that because many of these states are migrant or immigration states, we know that there are a lot of people that are willing to work for possibly lower wages in those states. We also can see this is a map up here of what's called a right to work law, which is essentially a law that makes it very difficult for labor unions to organize. A union or a workers' union would organize to fight for better working conditions or maybe better pay. And because of that, it makes it a little more difficult for factory owners. These right to work states then are really beneficial in some cases to factory owners, which may also contribute to the trend as to why we see more factories opening up here in the South. We can see that here. These were the old automobile industries, and we can see in the South here many auto companies starting to open up in that region. Labor is very, very important. The assumption from Weber's model was that labor was available only in specific locations. However, we know that labor is now available in many different areas, and those trends have changed. In addition, then, guys, we have to recognize that in many of our factories, human labor has been replaced by technology, and that can dramatically change these site factors as well. Probably more influential in Weber's theory then was situation factors. And he focuses specifically on weight. So he is going to look at three components in regards to relative location. You can see on these drawn triangles the P. This is going to stand for factory or production point, okay? This I on these two triangles is going to be the input or the raw material, right? The natural resources. And then the M is going to be our market. Obviously, if we're focusing on the secondary sector and we're looking at manufacturing, the end goal needs to be to sell your product. So we have to look at where we are in proximity to the market when we are trying to locate a new factory, okay? So we're going to define these factories then as bulk gaining and bulk reducing, okay? We'll start with this triangle over here, okay? A bulk reducing factory or industry says that the material, once it is produced, loses weight. So for example, okay, I put a steel factory over here. Iron ore, when it is extracted from the ground, is very, very heavy. And therefore, many of your steel factories, which I'll show you on a map on the next slide, were located during or really close to the resources, because as that steel was manufactured, it tended to lose weight. So you could transport more effectively this longer distance because your product was less heavy, right? It didn't weigh as much. However, once we take that steel and we start fabricating it, turning it into other products, we then begin to see it gain weight, which is why we see our factory located up here closer to the market. Those transportation costs are very, very important in regards to Weber's model. So to recap these pictures, Weber's situation factors really look at transportation. We have to look at where is the most effective place to locate a factory based on how much the product is going to weigh. Again, we can see that we would want to locate our factory near the resources if the factory is going to, or the product is going to lose weight. Again, we call this bulk reducing industries. We'll want to locate closer to the market if the product is going to gain weight once it's manufactured, such as steel fabrication. Here is a steel staircase, but we also see this in automobiles or in elevators or in any other property where we're going to gain weight, right? Another example then of a bulk gaining industry might be pop bottling or pop bottling. What we see inevitably, guys, is that this is a bulk gaining or a market-oriented industry. Since water is widely available, right? The soft drink, once it's actually produced, becomes pretty heavy. So for that reason, for example, guys, many restaurants are not sold the actual pop. They're sold the heavy syrup, and then they add water at the site, right? Which is close to the market or the consumer, the ones that are going to buy that product. This site and this situation chart here in terms of transportation is really critical to understanding Weber's least cost theory. What we have to understand then is that there are other factors that impact where an industry is located. So for example, we have to look at industrial location in terms of transportation availability. Some of your very first transportation networks were the railroads, which means that you had to make sure that your factories were located near the railroads to make sure that you could transport your product. We can see here, which is really interesting, this agglomeration. That's another factor that Weber looked at. An agglomeration is a concept where different industries will locate clustered near one another because they can complement one another. For example, then an automobile plant might locate next to a parts factory, right? Seats or wheels or whatever else that might be. In addition, then you might locate towards other similar factories because you can share things in common, or you can share certain jobs like building a new access road. What we can see is that the automobile industry really tended to cluster next to our steel factories. That was an agglomeration. Because auto industry is changing a little bit, it's not as prevalent, but we can still see that connection on these two maps. We also have to understand, guys, that there are a lot of changing trends that might also impact where a factory is located. For example, it used to be assumed that an automobile industry, because it's bulk gaining, would locate right next to the market. However, again, because of labor unions and maybe less environmental restrictions, or maybe the fact that states and governments are providing more initiatives to people to open up factories in the South, that might be why auto industries are trending to the South. Maybe the cost factors have changed a little bit. Maybe instead of minimizing cost upfront, a factory might look at the revenue it's going to take in, and that outweighs whatever cost is put up front. Maybe it's an emotional factor. Maybe an owner wants to locate a factory near their home or near existing factories. Or maybe it's government policies. Maybe the fact that government regulations have changed, and many governments are going to offer initiatives, maybe to get companies to locate in specific areas. International trade agreements, we may be able to see this. Because we can see certain factories that will locate based on global trade. At the regional level, a lot of times the government wants to attract outside industries and therefore will give initiatives to industry or factories that will move in. And really, guys, at the local level, there may be tax breaks or low interest loans that might attract companies to certain areas, which is really kind of what we can see over here in California with Silicon Valley and the availability of capital and loans in that region. You guys can see that there are so many different factors that impact where a factory is located. I think probably the biggest model then to understand that is Weber's. There are other models for industrial location, but none that have really been as influential as Weber's least cost theory. Okay, so now that we understand industrial location, what happens when a country progresses through different levels of industrialization? So what we're going to talk about now is this shift in the relationship with countries between manufacturing and factories. So let's do just a really quick history lesson here, right? Originally, products and goods were formed at home. This was the cottage industry. The cottage industry was when workers worked at home on a spinning jenny or whatever it might be to produce items. It was slow. It did not get done super effectively. And again, people worked out of their home. Then, during the 1800s, most of our production shifted from the cottage industry into what we think of as mass production. Now, that mass production at first was machinery and plants that were powered by coal and water. You already learned about that in regards to energy. And even in a factory, though, however, most of the production was still done by one person, as you guys can see in this picture over here, that did each part of the production. So over here, this is 1903. This is a factory where, again, we would see kind of an independent worker that worked in a factory. Clearly, you've got way more people. It's got better energy, but you still have each person that is producing their own goods. In the early 1900s, this shifted. This shifted to Fordism. This is when Henry Ford took a super progressive leap forward in developing the assembly line. So now in the assembly line, each worker performed the same task repeatedly, allowing companies to produce more standard products very quickly, while that need for really highly skilled workers who did every part of the product decreased. This became the standard then for Fordism. Now, Fordism typically was coined as a post World War II economic concept, but I think we have to argue that during the 1920s, we saw this assembly line. Because production increased, the cost of the product dramatically decreased. So here you had a variety of workers then that could really become an expert on their one product, in this case, the wheel or whatever you might be producing. Now, the product typically would be identical to one another, which unfortunately, I think in some cases really contributed to the lack of the variety that you got in more of a cottage system or even in the independent workers factory. The assembly line, though, quickly caught on, and really the demand and modification of production changed. This really impacted post-World War II economy. Although you have to recognize the assembly line during World War I and World War II is what really helped America to produce the things they needed during wartime. After World War II, America was by far the world's manufacturing leader. We saw the start of Fordism, again, 1919s, the 19 teens and 20s, but really post-World War II. That's where we labeled this idea of Fordism. Here, not only was an economic change, but also a social arrangement of this mass production. This also changed labor union memberships, where now that we're really seeing factory membership, people started to change the way that they worked for wages. And it also really created a stable, full-time manufacturing employment. This really expanded the middle class. Now, here is a picture, 1930s, of a Ford assembly line. Today, and I would say even as early as the 1970s, the conditions under Fordism that really had flourished throughout the 20th century really began to shift. So much of the industrial infrastructure, right, the factories, the railroads, they really became outdated. And a significant restructuring of the economy started, including what's called deindustrialization of a lot of your core countries, which remember are a lot of your developed countries. Over time, the machinery that really saved a lot of money began to deteriorate. Even if it cost a lot at first to install, it worked really well for a long time. Eventually, those machines don't work as well. Or people, I'm sorry, don't work as well as those machines. Over time, I'm sorry, the machinery is actually going to kind of replace human production. We know that machines, guys, can work 24 hours a day. They can also produce some pretty high quality work. And inevitably, what we saw in this post Fordist system was the lack of a lot of human labor working on the assembly line. A lot of these, again, aging factories, land values, workers' wages, taxes, they were really high. And so essentially what happened was that workers in many ways were replaced by machines. And especially when our manufacturing started to change and shift, this became even more of an issue. And we saw that in the deindustrialization and the transfer of industry. So this post-Fordist era really came as a result of corporations de-investing or not investing in the construction and the equipment and the improvement of a lot of those machines and the buildings and the land that these factories ran on. A lot of times then they would shift their investment. And what inevitably happened is a lot of big companies, more developed countries, started shifting their factories and their manufacturing centers to periphery and semi-periphery countries. These are going to be considered your less developed countries. You'll learn more about this a little bit later. The relocation then of the manufacturing and of the support services from one country to another is known as offshoring. That's one of your vocab words. In manufacturing terms, this totally reduces production costs because wages are a whole lot lower in the periphery and the semi-periphery. Those are going to be your less developed countries than they are in the core, which are your MDCs. Another thing that a lot of people did to save costs was they outsourced. Outsourcing is when a firm, many times a manufacturing firm, transfers part of its operations to a third party. So, for example, a computer company might sell its touchscreen factory, right, the ones that produce the touchscreens, to another company in a different country to manufacture because they can do it a lot cheaper. Then they buy back those screens from the company. Or maybe they eliminate their accounting department and then they outsource that task to somebody else. Guys, these three concepts, this de-investing in machinery, this offshoring, these outsourcing techniques, this really fueled the deindustrialization that really happened in North America. What we saw, you guys, is in the 1950s, there was 32% of American private sector jobs were manufacturing. By 2020, only 8% of our jobs were manufacturing. We saw a devastation of manufacturing here in our Rust Belt region. We saw these Great Lakes regions really what's called hollowed out as a result of deindustrialization, where so many of those factories either moved south or moved out of the country altogether. It is really important to note that although many manufacturing employments, jobs have declined in the United States, many times because of improvements in labor productivity, there has not been a full removal of manufacturing in the United States. In fact, manufacturing output in America has doubled since 1970, where we saw this post-Fordist era. Now, what does this look like for the distribution of different sector jobs? Okay, and you guys can pause and you can look at this chart here, but here's basically what we see kind of in a summarized fashion. Primary sector jobs are going to be highest in less developed countries. They may not quite be through the process of industrialization quite yet. What I want you guys to see, however, even in developing countries, the primary sector is going down. It's higher than in developed countries, but it's decreasing as the secondary sector starts to increase. The secondary sector jobs, right, those manufacturing jobs for our case, we recognize that there's been a really big growth in workers in the secondary sector, which notes that a country is newly industrialized. We call these countries our NICs, the newly industrialized country. As a country progresses through development, which we saw with the United States and Great Britain during the Industrial Revolution, the secondary sector grows at first, but then it eventually starts to shrink as the tertiary sector then replaces that. Remember, as industrialization increased, uneven development arose. We saw this as a really good example from steelmaking. Steelmaking is an example of a core business, right, or a core area. That's where the manufacturing is. The periphery then is the natural resources. That base industry, which was one, in this case, the steel industry, had way disproportionate economic importance in those regions. Eventually, as the years went on, manufacturing was located in countries in the periphery who had a mix of manufacturing and primary sector industries, which we'll look at a little bit more when we look at the world systems theory. The tertiary sector then is obviously going to be way higher in developed countries, but you can even see the tertiary sector in developing countries start to rise. And this again is seen through some of our countries that would be considered either newly industrialized or ones that are really picking up their tertiary sectors. What we know, you guys, is that typically a national economy with, let's say, a primary, secondary, tertiary workforce of a 10-20-70. So 10% of the country is in the primary sector, 20% in the secondary, and 70% in the tertiary sector. That's going to be a developed country, as contrasted with like a 40-40-20, which is probably going to be a developing country. We have to realize, you guys, that as countries develop and post-industrialize, the secondary sector shrinks and the tertiary sector grows. So then what has really happened in American economies? We have seen a massive, massive shift in industry here in the United States. Remember, we industrialized in the 18 and early 1900s. Factories opened up in America, especially in the Northeast region, because of transportation and the availability of natural resources. But as America entered into a post-industrial society in the 1970s, a lot of our factories closed, right? We already talked about that. This created a post-industrial landscape where, again, a lot of our factories shut down and services and information processing really began to override that. This was the growth of the tertiary sector in the United States. When post-Fordism occurred, manufacturing centers closed, which resulted in then a change in the permanent workforce, right? The permanent workforce could change to temporary employees because of really now that machinery was doing a lot of the jobs for people, you didn't have to have as many workers on a production line. This completely changed the flexibility in many cases. Now, there are things called corporate and business parks that really have littered the landscape where our factories used to be. Some of these corporate and business parks, they take up entire areas like we see in South Korea. The campus, their corporate business park, is like 40 blocks of like 35,000 people employed in 135 buildings. It is absolutely a huge corporate park. This really has changed what landscape looks like. And I know this is really hard to read this chart right here, but you can see these companies in the 1980s who were the largest companies, right? Look at these. There is a lot of oil and gas companies, right? Today, look at the companies in 2020 that dominate the global market. They are tech and service companies. So really, we've seen a dramatic change in the type of companies. This has really resulted in what's called high-tech industries. A high-tech industry is one that develops and uses most of its advanced technology in the highest levels of research and development. So really, guys, these are your quaternary sector industries. High-tech industries have two different characteristics. There is a large amount of money that's invested in research and development, and they use high-tech goods and services to produce their items. So basically, they require really highly skilled and highly educated workers. This also leads to the importance of an agglomeration of industries or economies, which we already talked about. These are firms that cluster spatially in order to take advantage of this skilled labor. A technopole or a growth pole, or one of these high-tech clusters, if you will, is a geographically pinpointed center of economic activity for that high-tech sector. This replaces a lot of those old industrial centers and your agglomeration of factories that we used to see in America. These technopoles, they are hubs of information-based industries with really high-tech manufacturing. And again, it just allows for a direct connection to the skilled workers. We used to have an agglomeration of industries in the Northeast, right? That's where our Great Lakes regions was. Today, we see technopoles or agglomeration economies in the service sector. Silicon Valley is the largest of these tech center clusters. It's located in San Francisco Bay Area, metropolitan area, and it includes world-class universities. There's 3 international airports. A lot of our high-tech companies, Apple, Google, Facebook, they all have their headquarters here in Silicon Valley. There are almost no physical goods that are produced here in Silicon Valley. Instead, it is research investment. You guys, tech companies also have multiplier effects. They also have these spin-off benefits. It is said that a high-tech job actually creates 5 follow-up jobs. So where we used to see factories littering, if you will, the landscape, we now see tech companies littering our landscape.